Budget document to Council.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to make a presentation tonight on our 2016 draft budget submission. So the intention of our presentation tonight is really just to give Council an introductory high-level overview of what they can expect to see in the budget. And then it's our understanding that following this evening, we will break off into two committees to meet to review the budget and also the outside community groups. So with that, we'll get started. So some of the key points to just highlight in the budget for 2016 is that right now the draft has been prepared with a levy increase of 2.84%, a little bit over 1.8 million. And as a result of that increase, what would happen to the residential tax rate is that it would be reduced by approximately 2.13%. And this would end up meaning that the average residential property would likely see an increase in their municipal taxes of approximately 1.95% or $45. The ratios in each of the tax classes are the same in this budget document, but we would like to, through our budget discussions, we would like to do some further analysis and review the ratios, and I think we'd like to look at the multi-residential tax class ratio, and I think we're going to likely recommend to Council that might be an opportune time to start to think about whether we move on that ratio and reduce it slightly. The combined operating budgets for city departments have increased by 1.76%. And the last bullet point that we wanted to note as well is capital projects are 13.1 million versus 11.1 million last year. And we have increased funding from the tax base for capital. It now is a little over 2.5 million, whereas last year is 1.8 million. So it's almost increased by $700,000. High-level information on the community improvement plan. This is an important component every year when we start talking about our budgets. We wanted to give an update on some of the information with respect to our tax increment grants. So you can see in 2015 and now in 2016, the dollars are starting to be fairly significant. So the tax increment grants that will be paid out through the Heart of the City programs in 2016 are $419,000. And under the Brownfield program, just under $1.1 million. And so we've given you a couple of the properties down below on the slide with respect to which applications those relate to. So for Heart of the City, we're seeing the Edison building come online, Knox City Center as well, and then in Brownfield, some of those projects we've seen in the past, Harding Group, Cotton Mill Lofts, Riverdale Terrace, Goldmanco, and Smart Centers now is going to be the big one that increased last year and will carry on for several years. On this slide, I have had some questions in the past with respect to, and these are approximations, and it was really just to try and provide an illustration of when we see some of those tax revenues come back to the city once the program has met the requirements of paying out the tax increment grant. So if we take a look at the Heart of the City programs, the first column is what we're anticipating we pay out in tax incentive grants based on projects that are being built today. So we do have some applications that have been approved, but we haven't seen any development on those yet, so we do not have those included on our slides. So you can see for Heart of the City the amounts that are paid, and then you can see when we get down to 2025, 2026, you can see the city portion of the tax revenue that's being retained. More substantially, if we take a look at the Brownfield programs, if you take a look at that far column for the city portion of funding that's retained, you can see that fairly quickly in the next 4 or 5 years, there's going to start to be some significant tax dollars that will be retained by the city. And then by 2025, we're looking at $1.4 million. So if you combine those two programs between Heart of the City and Brownfield, in 10 years' time, we'll have an additional $2 million each year coming in tax revenue. So that has been a question that I've been asked lately. So, this is just for illustrative purposes, but we'll continue to take a look at what type of analysis and information we can bring forward to council. OMPF, we talk about OMPF every year. Our OMPF was announced in December, so in 2016, the city will receive $4,882,000. It's 85% of what our allotment was last year, and we receive funding in two components. We get an equalization grant and a transitional assistance grant. It would be my expectation that the transitional assistance will be going away. So next year, so this year our funding was reduced by a little over $800,000. I would expect next year we're going to see a reduction in our funding as well, probably by $700,000, $800,000 a year as well. On this slide, I'm showing the historical funding. So at one point in time, when we go back to 2009, we actually received $15 million in OMPF funding, and you can see how that has been scaled back over the years. And really the intent of this slide is to show that really we're getting away from funding through OMPF for social programs. So that really is gone. And what has happened over the years is the province has uploaded a lot of the benefit components of our social programs, ODSP, Ontario Works, ODB. So you can see on this slide what we're trying to emphasize is that although our funding was reduced this year by $860,000, what's happened is on the Ontario Works side, the benefit cost has been partially uploaded again, and so we've saved a little over $400,000 on that. We've also seen uploading court security costs of about $155,000. So although our funding's being reduced, we're still seeing those uploads take place. By 2018, court security costs will be fully uploaded, as well as the Ontario Works benefit will be fully uploaded. So I think those are positives, even though our funding's being reduced. It's not completely offset, but we should see that same trend next year and the year following.
Okay, Councillor Rabat.
Just clarification, Maureen, can you explain where that money comes from and where the cuts are being done by who, and the uploading, what that means to the corporation where that money comes from?
Absolutely. Ontario Works, that benefit component of the $415,000, that would have been something that would have been a cost that the municipality would have paid out in the past in conjunction with shared services with our partners in SD&G. Similarly, with court security costs, those are costs that previously would have been part of our police services budget. That uploading is now being, what we see is we see funding back from the province to cover those court security costs. And so that funding will come back as well in the next 2 years as well to increase those, the coverage of those costs up to 100%.
And the OMP funding, the reduction is the province is giving us less. Is that basically what that is?
The province is giving us less, partially because of the uploads, and then also partially because they're changing the way they're funding OMPF. So there's more assistance. If we could just flip back to my previous slide, there's more assistance that is now going to be provided for, if we look at that little section in the middle, I've got Northern Communities Grant and Rural Communities and Northern and Fiscal Circumstances Grant. So OMPF is going to the municipalities that I think are a little bit more remote that need more assistance. So we're seeing smaller northern municipalities now get more of the funding. It's affecting funding for communities like Cornwall. It also is based on assessment. So within Cornwall, we have had the benefit of seeing some increased assessment, some new development come into Cornwall. So as that happens, that will also impact the OMPF funding that we receive.
Thank you.
This page, it's a little bit hard to read, but it's a really good one-page summary just to show how we get to the levy that we require for 2016. So up at the very top, we have our departments, our city departments' operating budgets, excluding police, fire, and EMS. So their budgets, their operating budgets are going up by $868,000. Then we have protective services. Their budgets on a consolidated basis are going up $323,000. And then I have a section, we call it non-departmental. That is where we look at OMPF funding, federal gas tax, the tax incentive grants, our supplementary taxation, growth and assessment, and some other smaller items. So that is actually helping our budget this year by $90,000, primarily because of our growth. And then we have capital funded by the tax base. So our capital funded by the tax base in this draft is just under $700,000 higher than it was in 2015. We have our community partners, so those are the areas where we also have some mandatory funding, and also included in community partners, we would have the library, the health unit, Raisin Region Conservation Authority, the airport. Those groups are within that line. And then where we have funding for grant applications, that funding envelope we have kept flat to last year's funding envelope until we've been given different direction from council. And so that gets you down to the bottom to show you the tax levy requirement. And that's where we require an additional $1.8 million for this year's draft budget with the way that it's been prepared today. This is our operating and capital summary. So we just broke down our revenue and our expenditures between 2015 and 2016. So at the very top, we're showing taxation is going up by $1.8 million. That's the increase in the tax levy of 2.84%. Payment in lieu and supplementary taxation, we're showing that line. So in that line, we're indicating what our growth was, as well as what's happening in our supplementary taxes. So our supplementary taxes this year are not as significant as they were last year. And what happens when we show these numbers in this format, what you would likely expect is what we show this year for supplementary taxation of the $500,000, you would expect that to be your growth in 2017. So this year, we're expecting it to show up periodically on our supplementary billing as we get notifications from MPAC. And then what we would anticipate is in 2017, it's actually on our tax roll. We're showing our operating revenue going up by 1.7, our capital funding up by 1.2. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And then on the expenditure side, we're showing our operating expenditures, capital, our transfers to our community partners, police services, and internal transfers. Our operating summary, we're just showing here overall our operating finance by taxation is 1.8%. This includes city departments, police services. It includes our community partners, and it's pretty straightforward. If we move on to our next slide for our capital summary. This is showing how our capital is being funded on the very top. So you can see how we're funding part of it from federal gas tax. For EMS, we fund our ambulances through our reserves. We have provincial gas tax for transit. We're getting some funding from Province of Ontario. United Counties share in the funding of our capital for the Glenstoran Lodge. And we're financing some of our projects. We will get into that in a couple of minutes as well. And then there's some funding from reserves. And then down below we have our gross capital costs. This year I included our library capital on this slide as well, primarily because it's in this budget it's $250,000. It's a fairly significant capital requirement. So I just wanted to keep it in line with all of our other city projects. So on all of our project sheets, when we talk about capital overall funded by taxation, we will include the library like we include all city departments. Rather than take that offside and deal with it like we have done with different community partners.
Councilor Murphy.
Thank you very much. Just briefly wanted to make a comment. I like the fact we're doing more and financing less. That's a good sign. That's a good way to go.
Thank you.
We're able to do it.
So here is a really good slide to show council by department how capital is being funded. So if we take a look at, of course, we have financial services on the very top line. So financial services, we have some $270,000 in capital. Part of that is funded by the tax base, part of it is funded by gas tax, and part of it is funded by reserves. And so as you move down through the various departments, you'll see what is funded by the tax base, what is funded by provincial funding or grants or gas tax, and reserves, the counties as well, and financing. So per Councillor Murphy's comment in that far column, you can see what capital projects we're financing, and you can see that it's our municipal works fleet, some upgrades to our municipal works facilities, transit services, that would be our buses, and then transportation capacity, that would be, I believe, part of the Marlow extension, and then in Parks Recreation, that's part of Emerald Ash Borer. So what we have within our budget document book that council has received, there is a tab for capital. We have all of our capital pages put together, all via department, and so that's where we can get through, go through a detailed review of all of these projects. But I like this slide because it really breaks down by department how each of those departments are being funded. So some departments are primarily funded by tax-based funding. Others are funded primarily by gas tax when we get into infrastructure, as an example. This is a slide we've been showing every year to council for historical capital trends. And really, it's trying to show the capital over the years that have been funded by the from the tax base. So when we go back to 2003, the funding from the tax base was a little over 5.2 million. And then what happened in 2005, the municipality started to receive federal gas tax. And as the introduction of federal gas tax came in, we started to apply those funds for primarily roads and asphalt resurfacing. And so over the years, you can see that our tax-based funding for capital has eroded somewhat. It got down pretty low. If we look back to 2013, 2011, we're down to $1.5, $1.6 million. So really, I think what we'd like to see is we'd like to try and see more stable funding from the tax base start to bring that back up. We've got a combined capital funding column on the far right-hand side. This is really just to show tax-based funding. Keep in mind that this does not include all capital funding. Per your comment earlier, we also have funding that's financing reserves and other components. Here's a slide for protection to persons and property. We have over the years talked quite a bit about our budgets within those categories. If we take a look at EMS, fire, police combined, their budgets for 2016 are coming in at 1.12%. And then we also have typically shown the tax levy because several years ago they were approaching 50% of the tax levy. And so this year their budgets came in, I'm going to say they came in a little bit lower than what other city departments have done. And so what you're seeing now is a trend going a little bit the other way. So they're not using up quite as much of the tax levy overall. So it's dropped from 44.8% down to 44.1%.
That's good.
That's good. And here is another slide that I wanted to put up as well. And I'd like council to take a look at the second column where we have combined annual increases to police, fire, and EMS. If you look at the years, if we go back to, say, 2006 as an example, those budgets increased by $2 million. And then if you look over to the far right-hand side, you can see that the tax levy went up $1 million. So that's where money really was, I think, taken from other areas within city budgets to fund those budgets. And then as you scroll down, you can see there has been some fairly significant amounts. And there have been multiple years where funding has been allocated to those budgets, and it's been in excess of what the overall levy increase has been. So if we take a look at 2015 and 2016, their combined increases last year were a little over $300,000, and their combined increases this year are $323,000. So this is where we're getting some opportunity to take some of our funds and redeploy it back to capital is really what is going to be the conversation, I hope, this year when we get into our budget discussion. So our operating budgets are looking pretty good this year. there's an opportunity to reallocate some funds now to our capital projects. MPAC, we like to talk about MPAC and what's going on with assessment updates. This is a slide that we've had up for the last couple of years, and really the only takeaway from part of this slide is this is the last year of our 4-year phased-in of the 2012 market values. So what will happen in 2016, MPAC is going to come out with a new market assessment for all of our properties in Ontario. We were in a meeting not too long ago with MPAC, and they have given us a preliminary indication of what to expect over the next 4 years. So what will happen is they will provide us with updated information in 2016, and then that will start to be phased in from 2017 to 2021. And so the early indications that we have heard for Eastern Ontario, now we don't have Cornwall-specific information, but in Eastern Ontario, residential properties are going up on average 4% over the 4-year period. So that would mean 1% a year. So the residential properties are going to remain, I think, relatively stable or relatively flat over that next cycle of MPAC. What we did also hear, though, is we heard that on other property classes, we've heard that on the commercial side, the property, we're going to see increases in the amount of 10% for Eastern Ontario. And on multi-residential class, it's going to go up 20. And then in farm, which is, I don't believe we don't have too many properties in that class, but in that section, we're looking at increases in the amount of 42%. So that might have a fairly big impact on some of our outlying areas. The industrial class will be going up approximately 9%. Again, these are indications really just for Eastern Ontario. So we won't have that information likely until mid-part of next year, but we're hoping to have it mid-year to be able to take a look at it and better understand what's happening in the years following. Distribution centers and assessment appeals. We wanted to just remind council that we have several appeals outstanding with our distribution centers in the business park. And prior to 2013, there was this market adjustment factor that was applied to those properties where their assessment was 60% of whether it was the construction value or whatever they determined that value was, or the assessed value. And so in 2013, that was eliminated, and many of our distribution centers saw their assessments go up between 86 and 96%. And so those appeals are still outstanding. We are still setting aside funds for those appeals, but it's really just to keep council aware of it. The combined 2012 current value assessed for those properties is approximately $271 million. So it's pretty big for Cornwall.
Councillor Yvette.
Thank you. Maureen, can you relate that in tax dollars, what we're holding on to until the decision is made on those distribution centers?
Absolutely. If we just move to the next slide, I've got
I'm
a little
sorry.
bit, no, that's a very good question. So on this slide, we're showing an allowance for appeals on assessment. So I'm showing in that first column the estimated taxes for 2013 to 2016. And so you can see that right now we're collecting about, the current MPAC assessment is about $25.5 million. And so if we see a 10% reduction in their assessment 2030, you can see the cumulative estimated allowance that we might require for some of those DCs. But I think your comment specifically, or your question specifically, we have been setting aside funds for those appeals. Right now we have $1.4 million in a tax stabilization reserve. And now we're also setting aside in this draft budget, we have another $400,000 similar to last year that we'll be setting aside again. So that'll bring us up to 1.8.
So if we were successful, not, if they were not awarded with appeals, what kind of tax dollars would we look at for the city, getting back as be able to put it in the budget or whatever it is? This assessment, these rules were put together by the assessment people, and so it's not something we overcharge somebody for.
Absolutely not. This is a change in the way those properties were assessed. And so we decided, or council decided several years ago, that it was a good idea to start to set aside some funds to reserve for those, understanding that there's a fairly significant risk considering the value of those properties. Since then, we have seen a sale in our business park, and the Target Distribution Center did sell for something that was, I'm going to say, probably 70 to 80% of what it was assessed at. And so those are items that we don't know yet how that is going to impact the outcome of those assessment appeals. The other thing is that it takes multiple years to resolve these appeals. And so if we don't set aside some funds, well, then once you take a look at what that decision could be, then it's retroactive for years. And if it's across multiple distribution centers, that is where we could be, that's where we could have some exposure. So it is certainly a prudent idea to continue to set some money aside.
How long those decisions before the decisions are made, Maureen? I know that they're...
I would say that these are fairly complicated appeals, so I think it's still going to take some time. I'm not convinced that we're going to see resolution in 2016 for these appeals. I do not have any updates for council as of this point in time, but we'll certainly bring an update to council once we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You sort of touched on this, Ms. Adams, in regards to the former 11 Points Distribution Center, Target Distribution Center. My question, I guess, was before they closed, did they have an appeal in?
Yes.
And
so they had an appeal, and then that appeal is able to be carried forward and taken on by the new owner of the property. But on a positive note, I mean, that property sold relatively quickly. And then also, too, we're seeing significant investment in that property, right? So the new owner, Walmart, of that property, they've invested a substantial amount of money to configure the building to their needs. So all of that is positive, right? So it's not as though we're going to lose an assessment that we will that will affect shifts amongst our tax classes and maybe a shift into our residential class. It's more so what is the right amount of assessment and the right level of taxation for those properties.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is just a summary of our tax rates by class. So you can see that the ratio for the residential class, we always speak to it as 1. This is where you can see what the ratios are for multi-res, commercial, industrial, and farm. So for the multi-residential class, you can see that that ratio is almost 2.5 times what the residential ratio is. And so I think that we wanted to make council aware of that. We wanted to take a look at the assessments in those classes are going up significantly compared to the residential class. And then plus, when you take a look at how it's a multiple of the residential class, I think we'd like to start to come up with a plan to see if there's a way that we can start to adjust that ratio, bring it down over a phased-in approach, more in line with the residential ratio. So right now, the rates are, you'll see the rates are dropping by 2.13%, and that's obviously because our residential property are seeing increases every year in their assessed values currently. Also, too, sorry if we could just go back, I just also wanted to highlight in 2014, we adjusted another tax ratio at that time in our commercial class. So that part of the rationale then was with some of the growth that we saw within our commercial class, there was an opportune time to take a look at adjusting that ratio slightly. This is a comparison of the levy by class. And so if we take a look at our different classes, residential, multi-res, commercial, and industrial, you can see the 2015 share, the 2016 share. But what I think is really key on this slide is take a look at those last 2 columns. So you can see the percentage of the total. So if we look at the residential class, it's almost 51%. And then you can see in 2016, it's going down to 49.7%. So what you're seeing is a shift from an allocation of the levy collected from the residential class that is moving to 2 other classes, and it's primarily the multi-res class and the commercial class. And that's as a result of both growth and changes in their assessment outpacing changes in the residential classes assessment. So if we move on to the next slide, here's where we take a look at what's going on with MPAC's assessment. So we're trying to break out what we feel is increases based on what they're saying the market value of the properties are going up, and then the very last column is growth. So that is what we define as additions to our tax roll. So the second last column is how property values are increasing, and the very last column is new properties that are added to the city's roll. And so you can see, sorry, if we just go back, if we see that growth, you can see that 57 million in assessment, that is part of what I'd commented on a few slides back to say our growth was about 1.6 million. That's the assessment that goes with that 1.6 million. This slide is just showing the change in our residential tax rate on $100,000 of assessment. It's showing that our tax rate is dropping quite a bit, but keep in mind, we obviously know that our property values also are going up. And it's also showing, what I like to show on here is a little bit of information on the education taxes per 100,000. You can see that the education rates have moved from the province pretty consistently to kind of keep education taxes relatively flat to the residential class. However, when we move to the next slide, you can see that it's not quite the same for a commercial property. So it's important to understand for a commercial property, they pay a multiple of the education taxes that a residential property pays. There was a fairly significant change from the province to start to reduce that rate in 2010, 2011, and 2012, but it's been pretty flat since then. And so we've seen a slightly higher drop in our commercial taxes per $100,000 in assessment. In the municipal side, it's partially because we changed that ratio a few years ago. That's why it's a little bit different than what has happened on the residential side. We try to do a scattering of 500 properties. We take a look at what their taxes are in 2015 and 2016 based on the way we have the document prepared right now. And so when we look at that pool of properties, they're seeing an increase of 1.95%, approximately $45. On this slide, what I've been doing is been keeping my eye out on that municipal network information source that we all have access to. And as municipalities have been approving their budgets, I've been kind of keeping track of those media releases. This slide is just to show you what other municipalities have been finalizing their budgets at. And you're seeing a lot of numbers in around the 2.5%. It's quite common. And then really as a conclusion, we just want to reiterate that the levy is going up 2.84%. It's resulting in an average increase in the residential class of approximately 1.95%. From here, we're going to anticipate breaking off into meetings with committees. We wanted to have a copy of the draft budget on our website this evening for our partners in the media. The file is pretty big, so we did not get it uploaded on the website. We will have it on tomorrow morning. We will also have hard copies available if anybody would like a hard copy. And then I wasn't going to go through it on this document, but there's a couple of pages in the back that are appendices that show what's going on in individual departments. But those are really conversations that I think we like to break off and get into more detail and explain sort of what the changes are. We also have a slew of information that we try to make available for council via a resource page that's available to tap into a lot of our different plans and studies that have been done, our financial statements for the previous year. So if there's any questions on any of that resource material, I'm sure that we'd be able to get departments that would be happy to respond to questions. And that's it.